In the fading light of a spring morning in Czechoslovakia, a colonel from the United States Army found himself staring at something that defied all logic in those final, desperate weeks of the European war. Charles Reade had seen nearly everything a man could see in 4 years of brutal combat, had watched entire divisions grind themselves to dust against fortified positions, had witnessed the liberation of concentration camps that revealed horrors beyond human comprehension, but nothing had prepared him for the sight that unfolded before him through the lenses of his field glasses on that 26th day of April in 1945. The mist was just beginning to lift from the valley near the village of Hostau, and as it cleared, Reade could make out the forms of horses, not just a handful, not the broken-down nags one might expect to find in the wreckage of a collapsing empire, but more than 1,000 magnificent animals whose white coats caught the early morning sun and transformed them into creatures that seemed to belong to some other world entirely, some realm untouched by the mechanized slaughter that had consumed 40 million human lives across 6 blood-soaked years. 400 of these horses were Lipizzaners, the legendary stallions that had danced in the halls of Vienna's Spanish riding school for centuries, their bloodlines meticulously preserved through 20 generations of careful breeding, each animal worth more in monetary terms than the tanks that Reade commanded, yet infinitely more valuable in ways that transcended any price tag that might be attached to them. Reade understood in that moment that he was looking at living history, at creatures whose ancestry could be traced back through 400 years of recorded breeding to the 16th century, when the Habsburg emperors first established the stud farms that would produce these extraordinary animals. The colonel also knew, with a certainty that made his stomach tighten, that in 48 hours, perhaps less, the Red Army would sweep through this valley with their T-34 tanks and their battle-hardened infantry, and these horses would be lost forever, either slaughtered for meat to feed hungry soldiers or shipped east to vanish into the vast gulags of Siberia where they would work until they dropped. Reade made his decision without waiting for permission from headquarters, without consulting with General Patton or anyone else in the chain of command, because some things in war cannot wait for the grinding machinery of military bureaucracy to reach a conclusion. And this was one of those moments when a single officer's judgment would determine whether something precious would survive or perish. The story of how these horses came to be in Hostau, of how an American colonel came to be contemplating their rescue in the dying days of the Third Reich, begins 3 days earlier on the 23rd of April, when a German lieutenant colonel named Walter Holters walked across the front lines under a white flag of truce, his hands trembling not from fear of being shot by jumpy American sentries, but from exhaustion and the weight of the mission he carried. Holters brought no battle plans with him, no intelligence about German troop dispositions or fortifications, no offer to betray his comrades or his country in exchange for favourable treatment, but instead carried a plea that must have seemed absurd to the American intelligence officer who received him, a desperate appeal concerning horses. The German officer explained that there were 1,200 of them gathered at Hostau, Lipizzaners from Vienna that had been evacuated as the Soviets closed in on Austria, Arabian thoroughbreds that had been seized from Polish estates during the occupation, 600 Russian Cossack horses from the Don steppes that represented bloodlines as old as the Mongol invasions. The American captain listening to this listened with mounting skepticism because the Third Reich was collapsing around them. Berlin was burning under a rain of Soviet artillery shells and Allied bombs. Entire German armies were disintegrating, and here stood a Wehrmacht officer who wanted to discuss the fate of horses as if they mattered more than the millions of refugees clogging the roads or the concentration camp survivors who needed immediate assistance. But Holters persisted, leaning forward across the table in the interrogation room, his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep, trying to make these Americans understand what was at stake. These were not just horses, he insisted. They represented 1,000 years of selective breeding, centuries of accumulated knowledge about bloodlines and genetics and the art of creating animals that embodied perfection of form and function. If the Soviets captured them, and there was no doubt that the Soviets would capture them unless someone intervened, they would be slaughtered for meat within days, or perhaps shipped to Siberian mining camps where they would haul ore carts until they died, because the Red Army had no appreciation for such refinements, no understanding of what these animals represented. The numbers Holters cited were staggering in their implications. 1,200 horses with a combined value of $20 million in 1945 currency, which translated to something close to $300 million in the dollars of future decades. But the money was almost beside the point, because what these horses represented could not be measured in mere financial terms. The Lipizzaners alone, Holters explained with growing passion, had required 20 generations to perfect, each stallion carefully selected for breeding based on conformation and temperament and 100 other subtle qualities that only experts could properly evaluate, with bloodlines that stretched back to 1580 when the Habsburg Archduke Charles established the stud farm at Lipizza in modern-day Slovenia. These horses were living art, the product of centuries of human dedication to an ideal of equine beauty and capability, and to lose them would be to sever a thread connecting the present to a past that predated the modern world with all its machinery and mechanization. The message from Holters worked its way up through the American chain of command until it reached Colonel Charles Reed, who commanded the 2nd Cavalry Regiment, though by 1945 cavalry meant tanks and armoured vehicles rather than the horses that Reed had trained on when he first joined the army in an era that already seemed impossibly distant. Reed had been cavalry in the old sense, had learned to ride before the war transformed everything, before mechanization turned cavalrymen into tank commanders and replaced the relationship between rider and mount with the impersonal efficiency of internal combustion engines and armor plate. Some of his men still remembered horses too, the old-timers who had enlisted when the army still maintained horse cavalry units and when the idea of charging into battle on horseback did not seem like a quaint anachronism from a bygone era. Reed called his staff together and told them simply that they were going to perform one last cavalry operation in this war, one final mission that would honour the traditions they had trained in before tanks and half-tracks replaced the animals that had carried soldiers into battle for thousands of years. He did not ask for permission from Patton, did not wait for authorization from higher headquarters, because he understood that by the time the request worked its way through channels and came back with an answer, the opportunity would be lost, and the horses would be dead or gone. On that same day, the 26th of April, another German officer arrived at American lines with more detailed information about the situation at Hostau. This was Captain Rudolf Lessing, not a colonel, as some later accounts would incorrectly claim, but a veterinarian who had spent the war years working with horses rather than fighting, breeding and caring for animals while his countrymen died by the millions on battlefields from Stalingrad to Normandy. Lessing brought maps showing the layout of the stud farm at Hostau, intelligence about the positions of guards and the strength of the garrison, and most importantly, he brought a promise that the German soldiers stationed there would surrender to American forces, would lay down their weapons and cooperate fully, but only to Americans, never to the Soviets whose treatment of German prisoners was already legendary for its brutality. The distinction mattered enormously to these men, who understood that capture by the Western Allies meant survival in a prisoner-of-war camp with adequate food and medical care, and eventual repatriation, while capture by the Red Army meant years in a Siberian labour camp if they were lucky, or a bullet in the back of the head if they were not. Captain Thomas Stewart from the American side accompanied Lessing back to Hostau on a reconnaissance mission, travelling through territory that was contested and dangerous, where SS patrols roamed looking for deserters to execute on the spot as examples to anyone else who might be contemplating surrender, and where Soviet scout units probed westward, searching for weak points in the German defences. When Stewart finally reached Hostau and saw the horses with his own eyes, he understood immediately that Holters and Lessing had not been exaggerating, that if anything they had understated the magnitude of what was at risk. 400 Lipizzaners stood in their paddocks, their white coats gleaming in the sunlight, moving with a grace that seemed almost supernatural. 100 Arabian horses included a stallion named Witez, two who would go on to sire champions for decades after the war ended, his bloodline influencing American horse breeding for generations to come. 200 thoroughbred racehorses represented the best of European racing stock, animals worth fortunes on their own, and 600 Cossack horses bred for endurance in the harsh climate of the steppes stood as testament to Russian equestrian traditions that stretched back centuries. Stuart radioed back to Reed with a simple message that confirmed everything. It was all true, every word of the German officers' reports, and the horses needed to be evacuated immediately because time was running out. At 4 in the morning on the 28th of April, Major Robert Andrews led the assault force that would attempt the rescue, riding at the head of a column that consisted of 325 men in 41 vehicles, carrying orders that were deliberately vague because what they were about to attempt existed in a grey area of military regulations. The official designation was reconnaissance in force with instructions to secure enemy resources, which could mean almost anything and gave Andrews the flexibility to act as circumstances dictated. Private Tom Stewart from Oklahoma, no relation to the captain who had scouted Hostow, wrote in his diary that their captain had told them they were going after horses, which made his friend Johnson think the officer had been drinking. But Stewart had noticed the supply trucks being loaded with halters and lead ropes instead of ammunition, and he realized that in the middle of what was supposed to be the final offensive against Nazi Germany, they were actually going to try to rescue horses. The convoy burned through 1,200 gallons of gasoline to make the journey, fuel that at wartime allocation rates would have been sufficient to send a medium bomber to Berlin and back with a full payload of high-explosive bombs, but instead was being consumed in an operation to save animals. They crossed into Czechoslovakia at dawn, their vehicles grinding over roads that had been pounded by years of military traffic, passing through villages where the inhabitants watched them with expressions that mixed hope and fear in equal measure. The German garrison at Hostow was waiting for them, but not with weapons raised and prepared to fight, because Captain Lessing had spent weeks preparing them for this moment, convincing his fellow officers and the enlisted men under their command that surrender to the Americans represented their best chance of survival, that cooperation would be rewarded with decent treatment, while resistance would only prolong the inevitable and probably result in their deaths. Captain Wolfgang Kroll, one of the German officers at Hostow, would later write to his sister describing the surreal scene of American forces arriving at their post, not as conquerors storming a position, but almost as business partners, with the American major shaking hands with the German colonel as if they were negotiating a commercial transaction rather than the surrender of a military installation in the final days of a war that had killed tens of millions. But even as this unusual alliance was being formalized, even as Germans and Americans were working out the details of how they would cooperate to save the horses, the Red Army was advancing from the east, their tanks covering 20 miles per day as they swept through Czechoslovakia, crushing the last pockets of German resistance and racing toward their final objectives. The mathematics of the situation were terrifying in their simplicity. The Soviets were 40 miles away and advancing at 20 miles per day, which gave Andrews approximately 2 days, perhaps less if the Soviet commanders decided to push their forces harder in these final weeks of the war. 1,200 horses needed to be moved, and each of those horses presented challenges that went far beyond simply leading them down a road. The Lipizzaner mares weighed 1,100 pounds apiece, powerful animals but also delicate in their way, stressed by the sounds of war and the disruption of their routines. The foals could not travel fast, managing perhaps 10 miles per hour at maximum, and the journey to American lines covered 35 miles through territory that was still contested, where SS fanatics might attack without warning and where Soviet advance units could appear at any moment. Andrews made a decision that violated every regulation in the book governing the occupation of enemy territory and the treatment of captured soldiers. He armed the German guards, returning their weapons to them and effectively making them temporary allies in the mission to protect the horses. 300 Wehrmacht soldiers, who hours before had been enemies of the United States, were now partners in what some wit dubbed Stuart's Foreign Legion, an ad hoc force of Americans and Germans and Russian Cossacks who had refused to return to Stalin's Soviet Union, all working together to accomplish something that transcended the usual categories of war. One German sergeant, receiving his rifle back from an American lieutenant, asked with obvious confusion whether they were expected to fight against their own people, against other Germans who might try to stop the evacuation. Andrews gave him a reply that cut through all the complexity and ambiguity of the situation. "I want you to protect the horses," he said, "from whoever tries to stop us, whether that whoever wore German or Soviet or any other uniform." The evacuation began at noon with Private First Class Joe Carpenter from Kentucky taking charge of 12 Lipizzaner mares, despite the fact that he had not ridden a horse since he was 14 years old and had never worked with animals of this caliber. His diary entries from those days capture something of the strangeness of the experience, noting that these were not farm horses like the ones he had known growing up. They moved like dancers, skittish and frightened by the sound of tank engines and the rumble of distant artillery, but willing to trust a human who approached them with calm confidence, so Carpenter pretended to be calm even though his heart was racing and his hands were shaking. The column that formed up and began moving toward American lines stretched for 3 miles, a vulnerable serpent of vehicles and animals and men winding through the Bohemian countryside. American tanks took the lead position, their crews scanning for threats and ready to engage any enemy forces that might try to block their route. German guards rode on the flanks, protecting the horses from potential attacks from either side. The horses themselves occupied the middle of the column, 1,200 animals moving in groups under the supervision of handlers who were learning as they went. Supply trucks brought up the rear, carrying 4 tons of grain and 1,600 gallons of water, because keeping the horses fed and hydrated during the journey was essential to their survival. At military procurement prices of the time, those supplies represented $12,000 worth of resources being devoted to animals, while infantry units throughout the European theatre were sending urgent requests for ammunition and medical supplies and basic necessities. 15 miles into the journey, they encountered the first serious obstacle when they reached a checkpoint manned by SS troops, not regular Wehrmacht soldiers who might have been persuaded to let them pass, but true believers in the Nazi cause who had not received word about any surrender and probably would not have cared if they had. The SS lieutenant commanding the checkpoint was 22 years old, a fanatic who had already executed 2 of his own men that week for alleged cowardice, and he levelled his Luger pistol at the German guards riding with the American column and spat out the word Verräter, traitors, before ordering his men to open fire. The firefight that erupted was brief but savage, with Americans and Germans fighting side by side against SS troops who could not accept that the war was over and their cause was lost. The horses panicked in the chaos of gunfire and explosions, some breaking free from their handlers and galloping off into the forest, requiring cowboys from Texas and Oklahoma who had grown up riding to chase them down and bring them back to the column. Private First Class Raymond Mans died in that firefight, taking a bullet that had been aimed at one of the horses, dropping to the ground and bleeding out before the medics could reach him. Technician 5th grade Owen Sutton was killed trying to calm a terrified mare, struck by shrapnel from a grenade, becoming the second American casualty of an operation whose entire purpose was to save animals rather than human lives. 2 men dead for horses, and yet the column pushed on because there was no time for mourning, no opportunity to stop and hold services or even to properly bury the fallen, because the Soviets were coming and every hour counted. A Lipizzaner stallion reared up in the aftermath of the firefight, pure white against the dark green of the forest, his mane flowing and his hooves striking at the air, looking for all the world like something from a medieval manuscript, a creature untouched by the modern world and all its horrors, though of course the war had touched everything and everyone in Europe by 1945. They pushed the column harder after that encounter, moving continuously for 18 hours, driving the horses and the handlers and the vehicles to the limits of endurance. The foals began to stumble after the first few hours, exhausted by the pace and the stress, and American soldiers who had trained as combat infantry found themselves dismounting from their half-tracks to lift baby horses onto the vehicles, carrying them like wounded comrades, because that was what they had become in a strange way, casualties of a different kind of war, innocents who needed protection from forces beyond their understanding. Technical Sergeant William Davis recorded his thoughts about the incongruity of the situation, writing that he had never imagined he would see the day when combat infantry would be carrying baby horses as carefully as they would carry wounded soldiers, treating these animals as if they were precious cargo that needed to be preserved at all costs. And perhaps they were exactly that, something precious in a world that had seen too much destruction. The sound of Soviet artillery grew louder as they approached American lines, the rumble of heavy guns clearly audible even over the noise of their own vehicles, and when they looked to the east, they could see dust clouds rising from the roads where Soviet tank columns were advancing. At 2 p.m. on that day, they finally crossed into territory firmly controlled by American forces, achieving their objective of evacuating all 1,200 horses to safety, though at the cost of 2 American lives and an unknown number of German casualties from the firefight with the SS. The mission was accomplished, but barely, because when Soviet T-34 tanks rolled into Hostau just 4 hours later, they found nothing but empty stables and abandoned buildings, arriving too late to prevent the rescue of horses that Stalin would have considered valuable spoils of war or useful resources to be exploited. On the 7th of May, General George Patton entered the story, though not in the heroic role that Hollywood would later assign to him in films and books about Operation Cowboy. Patton came to the village of St. Martin to witness a performance by the Spanish Riding School, a demonstration organized by Colonel Alois Podhajski, who served as the director of the school and had spent the war years trying to preserve the traditions and the horses that represented 4 centuries of equestrian art. The Stallions danced on a village street rather than in the grand halls of Vienna where they had performed for emperors and kings, with mud and tank tracks replacing marble floors and crystal chandeliers. But they executed their movements with the same precision and grace that had made them famous throughout Europe. They performed the capriole, launching themselves into the air and kicking out with their hind legs at the peak of the leap, a movement originally developed for medieval warfare to strike at enemies surrounding a mounted knight. They performed the levade, rearing back on their haunches and holding themselves at a perfect 45-degree angle, demonstrating the strength and balance that required years of training to achieve. Patton watched these movements that had been developed centuries ago for combat but had evolved into pure art, and his actual reaction, recorded in his memoirs rather than embellished by screenwriters, was considerably less emotional than the tearful response that would appear in popular retellings of the story. He found it rather strange, he wrote, that in the midst of a world war that had consumed millions of lives and reshaped entire continents, some 20 young and middle-aged men had spent their time teaching a group of horses to wiggle their butts and raise their feet in elaborate patterns. The dismissive language concealed a deeper appreciation, however, because Patton also wrote that he considered it worthwhile to preserve any highly developed art, no matter how fatuous it might appear to practical military men focused on winning battles and occupying territory. When Podhajski approached the general after the performance, begging for American protection for the school and its horses, Patton simply nodded and informed him that they were under American protection now, a guarantee that would prove crucial in the months and years to come. But the real hero of Operation Cowboy was not Patton, who arrived after the dangerous work was done and simply provided his approval and support, but rather Colonel Charles Reed, who had made the initial decision to attempt the rescue without waiting for orders from above, who had risked his career and potentially faced court-martial for diverting military resources to save horses in the final weeks of the war. The economics of what Reed had done remained brutal no matter how one examined them, because every day of the war cost America $300 million in 1945 currency, which translated to something like $4.2 billion in the currency of later decades. Every tank destroyed in combat represented a loss of $75,000. Every bomber that went down over Germany or Japan cost $200,000, $100,000 to replace. And yet Reed had risked American lives and committed valuable resources to an operation whose entire purpose was saving horses rather than defeating the enemy or liberating occupied territory. The critics who questioned Reed's judgment had valid points when they calculated the costs and compared them to the urgent needs of refugees and displaced persons and concentration camp survivors who desperately required food and medical attention and shelter. But Reed understood something that the critics missed, something that transcended economic calculations and military necessity, which was that when a war ends, civilizations must continue, and that continuation requires preserving not just lives, but also the cultural achievements that make civilization worth preserving. You could rebuild factories in 5 years, you could reconstruct cities and replace destroyed infrastructure with enough money and effort, but you could not rebuild 5 centuries of selective breeding, could not recreate bloodlines that had been carefully developed over 20 generations through the accumulated knowledge of countless horsemen and breeders and trainers who had devoted their lives to perfecting these animals. Victory in Europe was declared on the 8th of May in 1945, and by that time the horses were safely housed at Mansbach in Germany, temporary stables built by army engineers using materials that cost $200 per stall, multiplied by 600 stalls to house all the animals, representing an investment of $120,000 in facilities for horses, while human beings lived in rubble and ruins. Colonel Fred Hamilton of the Quartermaster Corps wrote in his reports about the uncomfortable reality that they were feeding premium horses while displaced persons subsisted on survival rations, noting that each horse consumed 20 pounds of grain daily at a cost of $8 per animal, which when multiplied by 1,200 horses meant they were spending nearly $10,000 every day just to feed animals. The expenditure seemed impossible to justify on any rational basis, yet something unexpected began happening in those weeks after the war ended that suggested the horses served a purpose beyond their intrinsic value or historical significance. American soldiers started visiting the stables at Mansbach, not because they had been ordered to go there, but because they wanted to see the horses everyone was talking about. Farm boys from Iowa, who had grown up around livestock, and city kids from Brooklyn, who had never been within 10 feet of a horse in their lives, all made the trip to stand outside the paddocks and watch these magnificent white animals moving in the sunlight. They had seen too much death in the preceding months and years, had witnessed horrors that would haunt them for the rest of their lives, and the horses represented something different, something clean and beautiful that the war had not managed to destroy. Private Anthony Romano from Philadelphia wrote home to his family describing his visit to see the horses, noting that they were pure white and clean, looking like nothing the war had touched, and that a tough sergeant from Texas had stood next to him crying openly, saying it was the first beautiful thing he had seen in 2 years of combat. The Army's Morale Division noticed this phenomenon and began organizing formal demonstrations where the Spanish Riding School would perform for American troops, with 20,000 soldiers watching these performances over 3 weeks. The cost of staging these demonstrations came to approximately $40,000, a significant expenditure that required approval from headquarters, but the value to troop morale was considered immeasurable by the officers responsible for helping traumatized soldiers transition from combat to peacetime. By October of 1945, the immediate crisis had passed, but the horses still needed permanent homes, and Podhajski negotiated tirelessly with American officials and Austrian authorities and even Soviet representatives to find a solution that would ensure the survival of the Spanish riding school and its traditions. The Americans eventually devised a plan to move the school to Wels in the American occupation zone of Austria, where they would build new facilities and establish breeding programs and keep the centuries-old tradition alive. The cost of this relocation came to $2.4 million, an enormous sum that had to be justified to budget committees and military planners who questioned whether preserving an equestrian academy should be a priority for an occupation force responsible for governing a defeated nation. The justification offered was that this represented cultural preservation equivalent to saving artwork from destruction by the Nazis, protecting heritage that belonged not just to Austria or Germany, but to human civilization as a whole, and when framed in those terms, the expenditure became easier to defend. Private James Patterson, who was assigned to help with the move to Wels, wrote about the strange experience of loading horses worth more than his annual salary into trucks normally used for transporting ammunition, with each stallion receiving 2 handlers and special feed and blankets, treated like visiting royalty, which in a sense they were, representatives of a tradition that predated modern nation-states and would presumably outlast them as well. In March of 1946, 200 horses were shipped to America, not 48 as some later accounts would incorrectly claim, animals with a combined value exceeding $1 million, making the dangerous Atlantic crossing in the hold of a transport ship. The voyage nearly ended in disaster when a North Atlantic storm struck the vessel with such force that the horses literally burst out of their stalls, panicking and threatening to capsize the ship, with their combined weight shifting unpredictably as the vessel rolled in heavy seas. But through a combination of skill and luck, none of the animals were lost, and they arrived safely at Newport News in Virginia. Customs officials processing the shipment did not know how to classify these horses, debating whether they should be listed as military equipment or agricultural imports or war reparations, eventually settling on the category of livestock, miscellaneous, which required payment of an import duty amounting to $24,000 that the Army paid without complaint. The horses that came to America included 3 Lipizzaner stallions and 6 mares, gifts from Podhajski to Colonel Fred Hamilton as thanks for American support, plus dozens of Arabians, including Witez II, who would become one of the most influential sires in American horse breeding history. They were dispersed to various locations across the United States, with some going to the Kellogg Ranch in California and others to military remount stations in Virginia, where they would be bred to American mares and their bloodlines incorporated into domestic breeding programs. By 1950, those 200 horses had produced 800 foals, animals with a combined value of $6 million, which finally made the economics of the rescue make sense to the accountants who had questioned whether saving horses was a legitimate use of military resources during wartime. 10 years after the war ended, the Spanish riding school performed in Vienna again, back in the Imperial Palace where they had danced for 400 years before the war forced their evacuation, possible only because the Soviets had finally withdrawn from the city and allowed the school to return to its traditional home. Colonel Podhajski, by then serving as Director Emeritus, watched that performance from the gallery, with Colonel Charles Reed sitting beside him as guest of honor, 2 men who had collaborated to save something precious in the midst of terrible destruction. Reed's son, Lieutenant Thomas Reed, was present that night and later wrote about something his father said while watching the horses perform, a rare moment of reflection from a man who rarely talked about his wartime experiences, observing simply that they had destroyed so much in that war, whole cities and whole nations reduced to rubble. But they had saved this, had preserved something beautiful that might otherwise have been lost forever. The economics tell one version of the story, a narrative of costs and expenditures that seem difficult to justify when examined coldly. Operation Cowboy cost the United States Army $3.6 million, equivalent to $48 million in the currency of later decades, all spent to save horses while Europe starved and refugees walked barefoot through winter snow and displaced persons lived in camps waiting for countries willing to accept them. Critics called it Reed's folly, dismissed it as a cavalry officer's nostalgia project, protecting aristocratic toys while real human needs went unmet, and they were not entirely wrong in their assessment because resources are always finite, and every dollar spent on horses was a dollar that could not be spent on food or medicine or shelter for suffering human beings. But the other story matters too. The narrative that recognizes these horses represented something irreplaceable that transcended their monetary value or even their historical significance, that they embodied civilization itself, the idea that beauty matters and culture survives wars and that enemies can become allies when they find something worth saving together. In his final report on Operation Cowboy, Colonel Reed wrote with simple eloquence about what the mission had meant, noting that they were cavalry, had been trained as cavalry officers in an era when that still meant riding horses into battle, and that this operation represented the last mounted operation of the United States Army, conducted not with their own horses, but with horses that belonged to all of humanity, to history itself. Today, More than 11,000 Lipizzaner horses exist worldwide, and every single one of them descends from the horses that were saved in April of 1945 through the efforts of American soldiers and German guards and Russian Cossacks who put aside their enmities to preserve something beautiful. The bloodline books maintained by breeding associations show a curious entry for that year in the location column, where instead of listing Vienna or Hostau or any other specific place, they simply record "in American custody," a bureaucratic notation that conceals an epic story of rescue and preservation. In 2015, UNESCO declared the Spanish riding school an intangible cultural heritage of humanity, recognizing its significance as a living tradition that had survived 2 world wars and countless other challenges. The citation mentions the school's survival through these conflicts, but does not detail how close they came to extinction in those final weeks of World War II, when the difference between survival and destruction came down to one colonel's willingness to risk his career and 2 American soldiers' willingness to give their lives. 60 million people died in World War II, a number so large it becomes almost meaningless, beyond human capacity to truly comprehend. And the war cost $4 trillion in the currency of the time, $25 trillion in the dollars of later decades, destroying entire cultures and erasing entire peoples from the earth. But in April of 1945, in the middle of mechanized slaughter on a scale never before seen in human history, American tank crews became horse handlers and German soldiers became American allies, and 1,200 horses crossed from one apocalypse into another life, saved by men who understood that preserving beauty and culture mattered even when the world was ending. In 2006, memorial stones were erected for Private First Class Raymond Manns and Technician 5th Grade Owen Sutton, the 2 Americans who died during the evacuation of the horses from Hostau, killed while trying to protect animals in the final days of the war. The inscription carved into those stones is simple and powerful. They gave their lives so beauty could survive, a tribute that encapsulates something profound about human nature and our capacity to value things beyond immediate utility or survival. Private Joe Carpenter, the Kentucky farm boy who had led those Lipizzaner mares to safety despite having no experience with such magnificent animals, returned home after the war and used his military pay to start breeding horses, naming his first stallion Hostau in memory of where he had participated in something extraordinary. That horse lived 28 years and sired 43 foals, each sold for prices that Carpenter could never have imagined before the war, when he was just a kid growing up poor in rural Kentucky, dreaming about a future he could not foresee. In his final letter before he died in 1987, Carpenter wrote about the experience of rescuing those horses, trying to explain to someone who had not been there what it had meant to him. This mission that had seemed so strange at the time, but had shaped the rest of his life in ways he was still discovering decades later. Another veteran of Operation Cowboy, a man named William Quinn, who had served as a master sergeant and lived until 2009, kept a photograph on his wall until the very end of his 91 years. Not a picture of his medals or his unit or any of the battles he had fought, but an image of a white Lipizzaner stallion rearing against a dark forest, frozen forever in that moment of grace and power. The frame bore a simple inscription that Quinn had written himself. April 1945, we were cavalry again. Words that captured something essential about what those men had experienced, a brief return to an older way of war, a last connection to traditions that were already vanishing in the mechanized modern world, and a chance to save something that mattered in ways that went beyond tactics or strategy, or any of the usual calculations of military necessity, proving that even in the midst of total war, there remained space for acts of preservation and grace and unexpected beauty.